of. This all started from a nerd snipe, so I'd like to thank Ryan, Andrew, and Dan. And the basic premise is discussing WW2 crypto over brunch, just discussing it. What is the mathematical implementation or asymmetric cipher? What could you most do if you didn't have a computer? If you were dropped in the Allies in World War II, I'm now being taped? Sweet. What could you actually do? So we'll go back to actually the format of the talk. And we're going to go very simply, criteria, what are we evaluating these under? We're going to follow some ciphers through history. Then we're going to go and discuss a little bit about what people can do versus what computers can do in cryptography and where can we exploit the humans win. And then finally, if I were to do it with 3 of my dumbass friends. Wow, that's loud when I click. And so the criterion, or a note about cryptography, we're going to be evaluating a lot of these things under 2 properties: confusion and diffusion. Confusion basically says that the relationship between the key and the cipher has to be complex. If it's not complex, you can extract the key from just like a ciphertext plaintext pair. If it's not complex, things go wrong. Diffusion is a little bit different. Essentially, it states that any change in the plaintext should have a 50-50 chance of changing any little thing of output in the ciphertext. So if you change a 0 to a 1 in your plain text, everything you're encrypting it to, every little individual bit should have a coin flip of a chance saying that it may change. You don't know whether it will, you don't know whether it won't, but it should have an equal chance to change at any of these points. Now, one other thing, if you'd like to interrupt me at any given point, please throw up your hand. I will try and call on you and answer questions as this talk allows. And if I lose you for anything but the one place where I say, this is probably where I'm going to lose you, I would gladly grab you again. So we're going to start off with the Caesar cipher. This is the beginning of our history. What the Caesar cipher is also known as is ROT13. We can mathematically model it as map each character from 0 to 25, add 13, mod 25. Does everyone in here know what modular division is? Cool. Is that you don't? No, I do. Okay. Then just map it back to characters. So just A becomes M, so on and so forth. This is very simple, and this is one of the first real ciphers. Now, first off, confusion doesn't really have it. So there's a very simple relationship from ciphertext to key. Any ciphertext plaintext pair breaks it. Easy frequency analysis yells at it. There's a very simple structure to it. You can all see how to get from A to B without any confusion. It just makes sense. Diffusion. Any input letter corresponds to only one letter of output change. This is going to come up a lot for a lot of these things. This is primarily because a lot of the earlier ciphers were stream ciphers, and so diffusion properties aren't really pronounced in them. And verdict on it, it worked because none of Caesar's enemies could read. Essentially, what people realized is you were fighting barbarians. Barbarians don't speak Latin, so you don't really have to encrypt it that much. And have a fun fact. So a while back, Louis Armstrong asked Richard Nixon to carry his bags through customs because he was just an old man. Turns out he got the president to smuggle marijuana for him because that was all that was in his bags. So, go Louis Armstrong. Wow, this is a loud mic. Le chiffre indéchiffrable, also known as Vernier cipher. So this actual thing in front of you is what's called the Vernier tableau or the chiffre tableau. Essentially, what you have to think of it is as 26 ROT13s. Each letter above it actually corresponds to a different offset in ROT13. It doesn't have to be ROT13, but it's just an offset in your cipher. So it's actually 26 transpositions all at once. The way you actually do it, if you wanted to mathematically do it, is you essentially choose a symbol S. For every symbol S, you make a separate alphabet, a separate set of transpositions, A1 through AS, choose a key in a plaintext. To encrypt, you choose the ciphertext transposition, the plaintext letter, the key letter. So if we go back, if we're going and trying to encrypt the letters R with the key S in this, with this tablet, you would go R, and you would go down to S, and you would get, I think, J, but it's small on my screen. And actually, let's see, R to S, sorry, K. I was one letter off, I apologize. And you can see very quickly that this is actually 26 Caesar ciphers all at once. And to decrypt, you just do, instead of indexing on the plain text, you index on the key with the same set of letters. And this actually has confusion. So if you take a step and think about it, it means each letter is actually in one of 26 separate equations at any given time. There's now 2 separate lookups, so there's a level of indirection in the middle. It has a simple algebraic structure, but still much more complex than the Caesar cipher. Something called the Friedman test. So one thing is, so there's this thing called the Friedman test. The Friedman test essentially says, how often do letters in my ciphertext appear compared to the English language? It's also called the Kasiki test. And so it essentially is saying that there are letters that appear more in this ciphertext than they do in the English language. Even though you're encrypting with 26 different keys all at once, or 26 different transpositions all at once, you're still actually having a fairly strong connection between your plain text and your ciphertext. These two are actually still heavily related. This actually goes back to that simple algebraic structure. So confusion's actually not very strong in this still. Diffusion, because it's still a stream cipher, is every letter gets its corresponding output. The other thing about this is you also have to remember through this, if you have a plain text ciphertext pair, at any time you get the key back because you need it directly as a one-to-one lookup to decrypt. So you have to keep in mind that this is actually very problematic and very simple thing. And it worked because computers didn't exist. Like with computers, this thing can be broken with about 30 lines of Python in 5 minutes in an introduction computer class. But back then, this is from the 1500s. No one could do this. No one, like, this was considered like the impossible cipher. It was considered one of the it was called like the indecipherable cipher. It was amazing. And now for something completely different. So in the 1830s, ketchup was sold as medicine for a while. Yeah, I don't know why. So we went from about 100 AD to about 1500 AD, and now we're going to go up to 1940. Enigma. So the Germans are coming. Enigma is what's called a product of permutations. So a product of permutations basically says I have a bunch of things mapping A to B, A to B, A to B. How do I actually combine them all together to figure these things out? It consisted of 3 primary parts. A plug board, which essentially just swapped 2 letters and stayed static for the entire message. So every time I could put J and Q. Every time I would hit J, it would immediately swap to Q, and when J came out, it would get swapped back to Q. Or when Q, and on both input and output, sorry. So if you put J in, it swapped to Q before it encrypted. And if you put Q in, it swapped to J before it encrypted. And then on output, it switched back. A reflector. So the reflector is a little bit weird, and on the next slide, I'll go and explain what it does a little bit more accurately. Essentially what it is it maps one thing to the other and pushes it back through the system. We'll leave it, and a left, middle, and right rotor, which were essentially just substitution ciphers with like hard-coded substitutions that would rotate independently of each other, and they would be connected at a specific point, and that's what you would substitute on. And every movement in here is a cyclic permutation. Ignore those words for 2 slides. So what we have here is essentially a diagram of the Enigma machine I stole from Wikipedia. So you can actually watch the A go through a substitution cipher, go through a substitution cipher, go through a substitution cipher for the 3 rotors. Then you can see the reflectors actually has a static version. It doesn't move. While those 3 rotors continuously move, that reflector stays in the same position the entire time. The reflector maps it from like A to B or like J to Q, any of those things, and then just pushes it back on the opposite permutation of the cipher. So all it's doing is it's just pushing the exact same encryption back, going in the backward lookup. This actually provides massive amounts of algebraic structure and massive amounts of complexity, making it much more secure than if you just kept the left, middle, and right rotors. These are 2 examples, and you can just watch it flow through. And a cyclic permutation is essentially when I go around, I just keep on going around. So it's pretty much going, I'm going to go in some order of numbers, and when I run out of numbers, I start from the beginning again. It's essentially just going 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, or 1, 3, 9, 4, 1, 3, 9, 4, 1, 3, 9, 4. And so when we actually model any of the Enigma machines, they're cyclic permutations because they're just a rotor clicking 1 down or 5 down at a time, just continually going around until it rotates again and keeps on going again. And the better way to do it, though, is just think about it like it's Python. So to write this in Python, the one part that I essentially skipped is the reflectors actually a little bit more complex. But you can modify so L is the left rotor, which is essentially saying take array 1, L negative 1 is how to get from, if I put 1 in, if I go to L of 1, L negative 1, L of L negative 1, L of L negative 1 of 1 will give me the 1. And so they're just inverse and regular lookup tables. They're just substitution ciphers as they were before. Think of it as just the Caesar cipher for each rotor that rotates around. The reflector is just a specific permutation I grabbed, in this case, times 2 mod 5, so that everything mapped to one that I could easily find. And the plug board's just a lookup table. So all of Enigma we can write as essentially something very simple in Python besides the movement of the rotors, which takes a little bit of state. And then we can literally just write it as that one line in the second thing. That's all Enigma is. We can make these fancy words, we can say it has complex algebraic structure and the reflection is pushing things back, but at the end of the day you can write in about 12 lines of Python. This is fairly complex, but still works. And you have to keep in mind, at each byte, we would rotate the rotors and they would go and give, and L would change, L and M would change, but where that offset was wouldn't. Where the offset would change, but what they were actually substituting wouldn't. So while you're rotating, you're still keeping the same basic structure moving through it. And this actually gave you about 2 to the 67 different settings, which is a reasonably large key space, especially for the time. A side note is Enigma changed 5 or 6 times during World War II. I'm only giving you the middle one, which is considered the normal Enigma, which we discuss. And all of them essentially just added rotors or a secondary reflector after it, but this is just the simple structure of its lookup tables and going to and from. Before I keep talking, have a fun fact. So did anyone know that Buffalo Trace was the oldest operating distillery in America, operating for over 200 years at this point? I thought it was fun. It's also good bourbon. So some fun things about the Enigma before we go and start evaluating it, though, is you remember that reflector? That reflector actually made the opposite permutation come through it every time. But what that also implies, due to a little bit of how these things are going to look up on negative ones, you can never actually encrypt a letter to itself. So when you're actually going backwards through the lookups, you can follow any permutation of them, and you can actually see that there's no way in which a letter can encrypt it back to itself. There are a couple little bit stronger caveats in that, and this led to something called impossible differential cryptanalysis. So somebody please stop me if I'm sounding like you have any questions, And so what impossible differential cryptanalysis essentially says is there are some things that when I encrypt, I can guarantee you what I will encrypt to won't happen. In this case, I can never encrypt a letter to itself. This actually pretty much after 1942, no one thought of again until about 1998. And in 1998, we looked again and realized, oh, this is something that's actually really strong. It's a property that we can use against many ciphers. But like between those 50 years, no one really paid attention to it. The SIG-ABA was the Allied crypto device, which wasn't broken during World War II. You can think of it as Enigma with 16 rotors and no reflector. It was actually, and the reflectors actually added a lot of security to this. So the algebraic structure for the SIG-ABA was actually very simple comparatively. But it was also so much longer. It had many different substitutions, and it didn't have the impossible characteristic. So let's talk about the criteria that we have. The confusion is the relationship between the ciphertext and key isn't simple. All of those lookups add together, the reflection adds together, the plugboard adds nonlinearity, because when you're actually constantly swapping those two things, they don't change while everything else in the system changes in a linear fashion. So if you think about that cyclic permutation, you know how all of them are going to change except for the plugboard, which stays constant. This means that it's much, much harder to analyze because you have an unknown where you don't actually, it doesn't change and it doesn't work the way the rest of the system does. It's still pretty easily broken by computers, and it's still a stream cipher, so you only have single byte diffusion. It's the same as stream ciphers today. Like, it's secure because it wasn't even fully secure when it came out. Some of the later versions couldn't be broken by Bletchley, but like a lot of this thing was just tortured and destroyed by them. And so a fun World War II fact, though, is sweetheart crypts. So what people would do would they get a picture of them and their wife, put it on the grip of their gun, and like American soldiers would look at their sweetheart as they were shooting people, which a little bit more morbid, but also kind of cool. And now we're going to go probably to the last of our examples, which is the Vic cipher. So Vic was named for Victor. And I please implore you to just stop me from talking at any given point during Vic, because it gets a little bit weird, and like I'm going to be trying to explain things in it, and some of it you can tell they were just sort of throwing shit at the wall and hoping something stuck. It would probably still be broken today, but the guy who did it defected, and eventually that led to some basic cryptanalysis of it. And I would argue it's probably the most secure hand cipher ever. And it was the pinnacle of something called the nihilist family of ciphers. I'm going to ignore what those are a little bit, just because if you want to look it up later, you can. But it has a precursor to a lot of things we see in modern cryptography. First is what we call lagged Fibonacci generator. So we're going to go into LFSRs a little bit later, but a lagged Fibonacci generator is essentially how do we stretch a number. If I only have 10 characters, how do I make a long pseudo-random sequence? Lagged Fibonacci generators are still used today in things that we actually use. They didn't know what it was called at the time. Like, they did this and called it chain addition. But the code is pretty much the same in several Linux kernels to help get some randomness out of things. Disrupted double transposition essentially means we put everything into columns, shifted them around, but added random things in between, random letters in between. Now, what that actually did was it made analysis of it much harder. Things we do now via like SP networks, they did via what they call the P network. For them was the disrupted double transposition. Block-based, so your block was as long as your message, which meant that you actually had real diffusion characteristics. Your message was all considered one element that you would work on. And it had the concept of an IV, so if you encrypted the same message twice, if you changed the IV or message ID, it would encrypt to entirely different outputs. Like, these are things we currently do in modern encryption. This guy, oh, I forgot to tell you the year. This was 1955. So computers didn't really exist when they were doing this, and it's still secure. So there's a 3-part key and a key-ish thing. The date, which memorized date, which you would essentially memorize for all your messages. A lot of people, it was actually the date of, I think Stalin's birthday was the one that they chose. I can never remember, sorry. A key phrase, which was a line from a pop song, a message identifier, which they would turn into an IV, and an agent identifier. The agent identifier was usually a very small number of like 1 through 9. Then it went through a complex process that actually looks a lot like certain ciphers today. First, they whitened the key to stretch it out to make it more complex. Then they they did the Fibonacci chain addition to actually stretch out numbers and create their permutation network. They did further key expansion, chained again, created a distributed text checkerboard to essentially make a different S box every time. So every time you would run the cipher, you would get a different substitution network. Then they would do fractionization and transposition. So essentially they made an SP cipher, which is like what AES is, way before anyone had a concept of what this thing was. You can see it a lot in their fractionation and transposition steps because you could tell that they were just throwing shit against the wall and going, this should work. We're going to simplify parts of it during this talk, but we're going to try and give you as much of the thing as possible and discuss like why they did some of the things. So what you did was you took the memorized date and you subtracted the message ID from it, and that gave you your IV for the rest of the thing. So this meant that on any day they could just actually like change it and you would get an entire different cipher stream out of it, which meant that when they would say hello, it would look different every time. And when you would actually use the key, you split it into halves and they would usually be a 20-character string, and you would just split it into halves to make it last longer and actually have a complex relationship from part A of the key and part B of the key. The key we're going to be using for this is going to be ABCDEF, ABCD, and then Benjamin AG, which is my name because I needed something to think of. And now the way you and so what's weird is the way you got those numbers was actually very odd. So what they did is they indexed on the alphabet. So if you look at ABCDEF, it goes 1, 3, 5, 7, 2, 4, 6, 8. So you can actually see that A in the first position was 1, A in the second position was 2, and you just kept on indexing going up directly. So you actually had a semi-complex relationship from the key to the actual numbers you're using. This actually provided some security, and then they would stretch it. So they did something called chain addition, which is this lagged Fibonacci generator that I keep talking about. It's how they made their pseudo-random number generator. All they did was they took the first two numbers, added the mod 10, put it to the end. Next two numbers, added the mod 10, put it to the end. You can see like 8 plus 6, 4, put it to the end. 6 plus 7, which is the next index, 3, put it to the end, and just keep going until they got 10. So you do this until the number is as long as half the key. So this meant that you could actually just choose a random, this was our IV, and this actually gave us our base element that we would whiten the key with. And we could then combine the IV and key. All we did was add each digit mod 10. So all of this carryless adding made the structure essentially seem like it was in what's called a field. Like this was a Galois field of 10. We usually do things in Galois fields of 2 or like 128, things like that, or 2 to the 128. And essentially it meant that every operator acted independently of each other. This is a lot like XOR, but for base 10 addition. This is XOR for people. Hey. And now we can do a couple, okay. Now we get into checkerboarding. So this is going to be where it starts getting weird. First, we index against the second key. So all the way back, we had the 348 number, which is Benjamin AG. And so 1 goes to 3, 2 goes to 4, 3 goes to 8, and our number of 99225322, which was our IV, our key combined with our IV, then transports to 5544189444. So does anyone understand what I just said? Okay. So we got the message ID, which gave us the IV. People with me here? Okay. We add those two together, doing carryless add at every time. So 1 plus 3 is only 1, or 8 plus 3 is 1. And you would put the 8, ignore the carry. And you would keep going. So that gave us 9922536222. We still good? Okay. Now, you took our second key, which was 34871960025, way back when we did that weird like indexing thing for Benjamin AG, and you actually map characters onto it. So 1 now becomes 3. It's essentially just a substitution network. So 1 becomes 3, 2 becomes 4, 3 becomes 8, back to this. And we take the number 9922, which we got from combining our message, our IV, and our key, and we map that to the same corresponding number. This actually adds a full layer of indirection back to it and whitens it with both halves of the key at the same time, but never directly uses the second part of the key. So this is only ever used as an implied function, which creates a very complex structure coming back to it. Since you have a whole set of equations you know nothing directly about. You have to only work on it on secondary characteristics. And then chain add this until you get 50 numbers. So just do the same chain addition from before, and just go until you have 50 characters, and we're going to take the last 10. So the last 10 for this, as you can see, is 67767 85345. And you do that same weird indexing thing where you start it and grab the lowest number, and every time it appears, you keep going. So in this case, 3 is the lowest number, so that becomes 1. 4 is the lowest number, so it becomes 2. Then 5 occurs twice, so you grab the first 5, which becomes 3, and the second 5, which becomes 4. And you do this until you have 0 through 9, 0 being the highest number, not the lowest. And you put it in a checkerboard. So this checkerboard is actually very interesting because, well, so first off, the first word is Estonia R. You'll see it randomly in cryptography. Those are the most common letters in the English language. So the top row is very, very common letters. Then the next 2 rows are just B through Z put out. You have 2 blank spaces. You have those 2 blank spaces so that when you do transposition, you just have space that no one knows what's going on. This made cryptanalysis of this much harder because you would never see just 2 or 5 independently. And so what you would then do is you could encrypt via this checkerboard. So A goes to 1 because it's just there, and Q goes to 97. So you can see it's on the second row, so it starts with 9. I'm getting picture taken, sorry. And 7 goes down, and you can see 97. So if we wanted to encrypt the phrase Haya, you would get 203931. So one of the interesting facts about this is any letter you encrypt doesn't encrypt to the same length ciphertext. You could actually encrypt a 10-character message and it require 10 characters, or you could encrypt a 10-character message and require 10 characters. So this actually adds a very large diffusion property to this, because if any letter changes, you can actually change the length of the entire ciphertext, which greatly changes the fractionation and transposition part of this. And before we get to the transposition part, have a fun fact. The atomic bomb, the total amount of nuclear material that was actually fissilized weighed less than a paperclip for Hiroshima. So that big thing came from something about yay big. So now we're going to get to transposition. This is the part where I'm probably going to lose some of you. So transposition was a mechanical process which you can tell they were throwing things against the wall trying to figure out what would work and went, this looks really confusing, so it'll work. It's really confusing, so it'll work because it was meant to be confusing. They didn't know what exactly they needed to do, but they knew they needed to do a bunch of complex things in order to make it secure. Its primary purpose is to rearrange the characters in a random order. Please don't feel bad if you get lost. So first we grab the last 2 unequal digits from that string before, which are 4 and 5. So if there was 5, 5, you would grab those 2, you would grab the one before it, but in this case it's 4 and 5. You add it to your agent number. For us, we're going to call it 8. So our actual length of our strings are going to be 12 and 13. Now, you take the matrix you generated way back and take the numbers, grabbing 12 and 13 characters in order of them. So you grab columns in order from 0 to blah until you get 12 characters for the first string and 13 characters for the second. You then write down the message back down in the transposition matrix, and you just rearrange the columns. So all you're doing is writing down the message in a table, taking column 1, moving over here, taking column 2, moving it over here, taking column 3, moving it over here, and essentially just rearranging everything. So this is pretty simple. It's just put it in a grid, choose which number you want, move it over until you get to where you're going. Then we have a secondary interrupted transposition, which gets really freaking weird. So once you have this one thing, you grab it and you put it back into a message where your agent number is back in, and fill the column and add garbage. So I'm going to show you a picture and explain the picture a little bit better. So let's say the top thing is our encrypted message. The second, the message, so the number is the key, is numbers from way back when. It's actually the end of it's part of the Fibonacci sequence from before. You then start with the length of your agent number. You take your agent number, you make string that long, and then one more, then one more, then one more, and then once you get to the maximum number, you start back with 5 and just go back down in almost a triangle motion. So you just grab them, put it to a grid, and put it in sort of a triangle-like thing. Then you just add garbage to it. So literally you just put in random frickin' numbers to convert this matrix into this matrix. Now, people are laughing at me right now, which I understand, but believe it or not, that add garbage step was frickin' hell. So that add garbage step meant that you didn't actually know what was part of your message and what wasn't. They expanded the ciphertext. You actually had no idea what you cared about because you didn't know what the message was. And then you just write it back out, going by the column. So you write the 0 column first, then the 1, you write the 0 column last, you write the 1 column first, then the 2 column, then the 3 column, and you've now actually just rearranged the whole frickin' thing. So you have a full substitution permutation network via the checker box and the transposition, and it all worked in 1955. So I'm confused as hell right now, but in general, this was multiple nonlinear operations with the key being implied through several of them, where the IV is pushed out. There's lagged Fibonacci generators to create random things, which essentially they're using complex algebraic structure. There's 2 separate whitening pieces where they actually go back to and from the generator, and they use an IV to make the relationship more complex. This is a good algebraic structure. We could never do this now because everyone would look at us like we were freaking crazy. It's full of side channels, all these things. But this is actually a really well done algebraic structure. Diffusion, though, when you go back to that checkerboard, any single character can become 1 letter or 2 letters. So if you change a letter that's 1 letter to 1 number to 2 numbers, when you do that transposition step, you actually completely change the output of that transposition step. So any single letter can actually create massive diffusion going through the whole thing. This is really intelligent. Here are links to the full cipher details where they actually go through it step by step, and yeah. Also, wombat poop is cube-shaped. What? So that's the last real historical cipher we're going to go into. We're going to go into humans versus computers. So humans and computers fundamentally different. Some humans are creative, computers are not. Humans can do big things, can figure out how to do big, massive problems and create creative solutions for all of them. Computers cannot. However, computers rock at base 2 to the x. Like, no one here can do multiplication in a Galois field 2 to the x like a computer can. It's magical. They can chain together millions of small problems faster than you can blink. They can do linear math great, and they can do mod base 2 to the x faster than anyone here can. We're not going to go computers suck at. We're going to go what makes a cryptographer sad. In cryptography, speed is king. That means you can't do non-binary power, or like base powers. You can't do 2 to the 64 minus 1. Like, that will break a lot of SAT solvers due to state expansion. I will never be allowed to do that, or somebody will kill me. And you can't do on-the-fly modification of SP networks, which you can do as a human. However, humans suck at bit level rotation. None of you want to rotate 1,907. I don't want to do that 3,000 times. I'll kill somebody. Big number multiplication, writing down a lot of things, and squirrel. The squirrel is actually important, so any cipher we design, we're going to have to be able to step back in the middle and start going again. So we care about offline processing. However, humans rock at base 10. Any of you can multiply by 10 in 1 second, and you can do anything, addition, mod 10, all those things. We can actually do small bases of under around 30. For the purposes of this talk, I actually memorized the times tables of 29 by 29, because that's the base we're going to use for everything. And smaller numbers and modular arithmetic we do great with. Like, we are not better, but we can do a lot more fancy things with it than a computer can. Also, if you randomly shuffle a deck of cards, most likely no one's ever shuffled that deck in the same order as you. It's 52 factorial, which is huge. So, old twists on modern ciphers instead of modern twists on old ciphers. What we're going to do is A5/1 in non-binary form. So, we're not going to go into the second one because I'm out of time. I'm going to be out of time. First off, what is an LFSR? Essentially, it's two things, a state and taps. What you do to get the next state is you multiply the current state by the taps and you put it at the end. That's all it is. So this is Python code to do this. This is of size 21, and base is what you're going into. So all an integer LFSR is you multiply, if it's for 29, you just put 29 as your base, and you just multiply mod 29 for each number. To step, you multiply the taps times the state. It's not complex, but it's actually really powerful. Also, World War II, they had a division that was essentially an arts and crafts unit that made fake tanks and convinced Germans we were invading France, and had a actually fairly high-profile general wander around with his arts and crafts project. So what is A5/1? It's 3 LFSRs all going at the same time. They're stepped in the fact that if any two match on a given bit, those two clock. So if 2 have 0, you clock those 2. If 2 have 1, you clock those 2. If all three of them match, you clock them all. You take specific bits out and you go on. So if we actually look through here, we can see this is the entire structure. So all you do is you take the bits out of 18, 16, 17, 16, 13, and you add it to the end every time, just XORing them all together. And the key bits you get out are from 8, 10, and 10. This is all this cipher is. This cipher is used to protect, or used to be used to protect pretty much all of your cell phone data. All we do is we switch this to base 29. So if we do this in base 29, we actually break most of the current attacks. You tap the two that are closest to each other, plus or minus 7, or you make a president, and anything which is plus or minus 7 in the president, that and the president taps. Otherwise, the two next to it tap. And you grab the same decided set of elements. We can do that. I encrypted a 200-character message in about 10 minutes. Moving to non-binary LFSRs makes current attacks pretty much not work at all because they're based around the sparseness of a matrix. If this forces things like something called Grosvenor bases, which is like an area of cryptography no one wants to really deal with because we don't have to and doesn't work great. We don't do well in non-binary things. It's very strong in confusion. The best attack against this cipher normally is 2 to the 20 and 2 to the 38 cycles. I'm never going to encrypt 2 to the 20. It's pretty much a chunk of the Library of Congress, like a non-trivial chunk, like a wing. I'm not going to write that much. And it's a stream cipher, so you have to do constant rekeying. Finally, we can do offline processing. We can do all of these things and actually write out all I would need for this before I ever have to do this, which makes our lives much easier. And it's at less overall operations per byte than VIC. Finally, have a fun fact. The first ever edition of the Daily Mirror, which is a shitty British tabloid, came with an actual mirror. My slides will be put online with a second system that we're not going to go into. Any questions, comments, concerns?
I have a practical one. Do you have a feel for how many pages and how much time it would take to run VIC by hand for a given length message?
For a 150-character message, it took me about 20 minutes. The issue is it grows exponentially because I can explain more. Also, I have a security token, security university token thing. Anybody? You wanted beer. What do you want? What's your question?
Oh, my question was if you could do a demonstration.
In 2 minutes? No. Afterwards, sure. Sure. All right, game close. Yes, sir.
So I have two, I think, quick questions. One is, in the Enigma, what element of it that adding more of or changing would increase the key space? Is it more of the...
More rotors.
Okay. And the other question is, for VIC, if somebody knew how VIC worked, would it hold up? If somebody just didn't know the key but knew how the algorithm worked, would it still hold up against, code breaking or other attempts? Or was a lot of it obscurity of mechanisms?
So the issue is, what does hold up mean? It would not be perfectly secure, but it's a big enough pain in the ass that I don't know anybody who wants to add. Well, it would hold up pretty well. It wouldn't hold up perfectly, but that adding garbage step actually makes the structure of it much more complex than it would be normally. Yeah. So I believe I'm supposed to finish. Last question?
Do you have maximum length LFSRs for base 29?
I have a set of maximal length LFSRs for base 29. The issue is the other one, I needed an NLFSR for the secondary scheme. That was much harder because that's a little bit more guess and checky. If you want, I can send you the code for the base 29 ones. Thank you.